Okay, we're live.
We're live, but I'm not going to say anything yet.
Anybody need a package? That. Yeah, you've got one.
Karen, why don't you come and sit around the table somewhere? Or you have to leave? Okay. Okay. On the other side.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mary Kruger here at St. Bart's. We're getting ready to have Jamie Ferrara's class about Jerusalem archaeology. We did want to have a dial-in capability for the class, but we're having some telephone problems, so we're just going to have video with sound that we'll be distributing later or live streaming right now. I'm not sure which, maybe both. Jamie's a parishioner and vestry member here at the church. He's also a pilgrim going on the trip and very kindly offered to look at Karen Armstrong's very large tome about Jerusalem and distill it down for us and help us understand the archaeology of Jerusalem. So with those words, I'll turn it over to Jamie and thank him heartily for this.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. This is great. So let me take just a minute to set up expectations for our time together for the next couple of hours. So first of all, what this session will not be, we are not going to talk about modern day Israel. We are going to talk about the archaeology of Jerusalem, essentially from the year 1000 BC to about 1200 AD. And the reason that I decided to do that was I've heard from many people that when you go to, it'd be great to have you sit wherever, but we've got a seat over there, and we've got a seat there, and we've got a seat next to Asper. If people go to Jerusalem, think that they're going to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. And I think that may happen maybe in one or two places, but most of the time you're walking about 20 feet above where Jesus walked, because there are layers and layers and layers. And in the last 2,000 years, it's been about 20 feet of sort of rising layers. And a lot of those layers are actually quite tragic. So that has to do with what Jerusalem has meant to the various groups that ruled it. So it turns out that, in fact, for this meeting, the book is a misnomer. There are four faiths that we have to deal with here. It's Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. But a big element of the layers of Jerusalem have to do with pagan Rome and what pagan Rome did to Jerusalem before it became sort of Christian Byzantium. So in trying to figure out how to address this, I'm now going to pass around a piece of paper. And rather than try to do, I thought initially we might do things, writing things on the, these whiteboards which they provided, but that's just a lot of upping and downing and backing and forthing. So I'm passing around a paper, and we're going to ask a two-part question 4 different times. And the question is, what did Jerusalem mean to blank? And then how did this meaning affect the government's approach to buildings, to the buildings of the previous government, and then to its own buildings? So it's just to get a sense of how these layers are working. And we're going to, and so I thought by asking this question at a number of different times, we would do that. Now, can people just raise their hands? Who's got a book? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 books. I would like to try to break this up. There are about 24 key paragraphs that I'd like to have us all read. And rather than having me read all of them, which would be really boring, I thought that we would try to sort of break that up. So I'm going to ask, is there anybody with a book or a neighbor of somebody with a book who would like not to be asked to read? Is that if I ask someone to read a paragraph? Okay, so we're going to do that. But just to begin, oh, and let me just say, so I'm hoping that we would, so I've given you all a piece of paper, you can take notes on it. If you've got sort of general questions, I'm hoping that we'll have maybe 15 minutes at the end at about 2:30 where we can ask some more general questions. But just since there's a lot to cover, and I'll be watching my watch fairly closely to make sure that we manage.
At
Yes.
2:30, there's a concert happening.
Right,
So
right.
I will be leaving.
Right, and by the way, anybody who has to leave at any point, be it for the concert or something less exalted, that would be absolutely fine. We're just delighted that you're here at all. Why don't we just as we start? Why don't we just introduce ourselves very briefly and just say whether or not you're going on the pilgrimage. So we'll start in the corner with you, Karen.
Karen Shadow, I'm going on a
Pilgrimage.
pilgrimage.
Perfect.
And I apologize for having to leave early.
That's fine.
Doug Tanner, we're not.
Carol Tanner, we're not.
Okay.
Flora, yes, I am. Farrar.
Jamie, yes, I'm going.
I'm Dave Price. It's always during the school year when I can't go.
That's fine.
John Gilliland, I am going.
Robert Guthiel, I'm not going.
Robert Kinsey, I am going.
Robin Woodward, I am going.
Bill Fry, I am going.
Leanne Fry, I'm going.
Astrid Orion, I'm going.
Jennifer Allen, and I'm going.
Mary Kruger, I am going.
Virginia Smith, no, I'm not going. Ellen Wolf, I am going, and this will be Dean Wolf, he is going.
Okay.
Eileen McKenzie, I'm not going.
Okay.
Ron Kimmelman, I'm going, and so is my husband.
Who will be joining us? No, you don't. Okay.
Miriam Schneider, I am going along with my cousin Greg from Twin Falls, Idaho.
Great. And
Dennis Tierney, I've been.
Linda Tierney, I've been.
great.
Linda and Dennis went 2 years ago with Bob Daniel, so we can ask them questions.
And at least for me, it's starting to get a little warm in this room, so please feel free to make yourselves as comfortable as you can be. Okay. So now.
And we do have a couple of people watching live stream, so.
Oh, great.
I think
Fantastic.
the beginning was on, because they were having trouble getting on.
Okay, great. Good, good.
All right. So someone.
And we have a, Peter just came in.
Oh, and Peter Abraham, who is not going on the pilgrimage.
No, but came to learn and listen.
So we're actually going to start with a passage from the Old Testament, which is very relevant. So I made about 10 of these. If you could share about every third one, Flora and I will share up here. And I think, do we have, is it passed around enough? Leanne, would you like to read the first paragraph? Would you be okay with reading?
This.
Yes, just read the first paragraph. So this is about, I'll try to remember to tell people on the streaming. This is from 2 Samuel, chapter 6. The Ark is brought to Jerusalem.
David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to, I'm gonna utilize some of these words, Bala and Judah, to bring up from there the Ark of God, where it's called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the Ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals.
Great, thanks. Eileen, would you like to keep reading after that?
When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the Ark of God, because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the Ark of God.
Robert, you want to read from verse 9 where it says David was afraid?
David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household.
Okay, let's stop there. So why is this passage important? And now I'll read just a little bit from what Karen Armstrong says. This is on the bottom of page 44. A king could not choose the site of a temple. It had to be built at a site which had been revealed as one of the centers of the world, centers in quotes. That is why kings so often chose sites of former temples which were known to yield access to the divine. A temple had to be a copy of the god's heavenly home, and it was this likeness which linked the celestial archetype with its earthly replica here below. Consequently, the plans of a temple had to be revealed, as they were to David eventually, so that the dimensions and furnishing of the God's home in the world above could be accurately reproduced on earth. So she makes the point a little earlier that David initially had not essentially gotten permission to move God's home, the Ark of the Covenant, to Jerusalem. And it was poor Uzzah who, attempting to prevent a catastrophe, the ark falling off, touches it and is immediately struck dead. So this links one of the central meanings of what will be Jerusalem to the Jewish people and both the religious center as well as the political center. So any comments about that? But it's quite a sort of a graphic story, and it shows the intensity of feeling about the presence of the God. Any thoughts about that at this point? Okay. Everyone hopefully has. Anyone doesn't have the what starts with the dates. This little packet. Everybody has that? Okay. So this is going on about 1000 BC. So the Ark of the Covenant is moved to Jerusalem, and then Solomon eventually builds the temple. Now, also in this packet are 4 pages of maps. And let's just look at the first page, which says Jerusalem during the first temple period, 1000 to 586. Are we all together on that? It's on the left-hand side. So what you see there is in the dotted line is going to be the walls of Jerusalem as they will be built later on. The solid black line there, which in the lower right-hand corner, which says the citadel of the city of David and then the Temple Mount, that's what people believe to have been the early city of David. And you will notice that so the upper part of it is the Temple Mount, but the lower part of it is actually outside of the walls of Jerusalem. And so here we have an area which, in fact, is already controversial. So there are, if it's outside the city walls, this is actually on the eastern side of Jerusalem. So that is now in Palestinian territory. There's an archaeological dig that's going on there. And it was actually in the New York Times, I think it was about a month ago, but how this has caused enormous friction because the Palestinians believe that the Israelis are just dumping historical artifacts on there to claim the territory and then encroach upon it. Whereas I believe that the area is in fact what scholars believe to have been the initial city of David, but it's where the boundaries are, who gets what, why do they get what? It is so inflamed that now people are saying, oh, that's fake news. You planted it. You're planting archaeologic evidence so that you can claim it. So, and that was the point of the New York Times story. But this sort of where the walls are, where the boundaries are, that's an area of still a lot of friction and tension. Welcome. Can you just tell us your names and whether or not you're going on the pilgrimage?
I'm Sally Armstrong, and unfortunately I'm not going, but I really look forward to hearing you.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Steve Hughes, I'm going.
Steve, and welcome to you. Okay. So,
Could you just repeat what part of the Temple Mount is believed to be outside the city walls?
so the Temple Mount is believed to be inside the city wall. So if you look at the Temple Mount, you can see in that map that the walls of Jerusalem actually go around it. But the citadel of the city of David, where he probably had his palace, actually lies to the south of the current city walls. So the Temple Mount is within, but the city is, or where they think he was there, where his palace was, is outside. Okay. So we've talked about the site of the temple and how important that was to the king. So who's Robin? Could Robert borrow your book?
Mm-hmm.
Robert, on page 50, could you start reading, please, where with the paragraph, we know from the Psalms.
The whole paragraph?
And read the whole paragraph.
We know from the Psalms, which are connected with the Jerusalem cult of Yahweh, that the temple was imaginatively associated with Mount Zion. Once the ark was installed there, the site became for the Israelites a center that linked heaven and earth, and also had its roots in the underworld, represented by the primal sea. Like the sacred mountain, the temple was a symbol of the reality that sustains life. Reality sustains the life of the cosmos. Like Jacob's ladder, it represented a bridge to the source of being, without which the fragile mundane world would not subsist. Because it was built in a place where the sacred had revealed itself in the past, worshipers could hope to make contact with that divine power. When they entered the holy precinct, they had stepped into another dimension, which they believed existed contemporaneously with the mundane world and kept it in being. Mount Zion had become radically different from the surrounding territory. Therefore, in Hebrew, the word for holy, kadosh, means other, set apart. The very plan of the building, with its three-tiered gradations of sanctity, culminating in the Devir, the Holy of Holies, symbolized the transcendence of the sacred. Entry to the Devir was prohibited to all except the priests. It remained silent, void, and inaccessible. Yet since it enshrined the ark and the presence, it tacitly bore witness to the fact that the sacred could enter the world of men and women. It was at once immanent and transcendent.
Right. Immanent or immanent and transcendent. So there's a lot in that paragraph, but it seems to me that it's really central to the meaning of the temple and therefore the meaning of Jerusalem to the ancient Israelites, that this was a place where I think in northern mythologies, they sometimes call it a thin place where the spirit world and the material world can interchange. And so this was really the center of their entire religious world, this axis, it's sort of like Jacob's ladder. I mean, literally a link between our earthly reality and God, right? And so the closer you could get to it, the more sacred it was. Only the priest could be there. And in the Jewish tradition, there was no cult image. This isn't so much necessarily the home of the God, but this is where one can experience the divine directly. And so this is, I think, essential to our understanding of what Jerusalem certainly meant to the Jews and to the ancient Jews, and perhaps is different from what Jerusalem means to everybody else. So let's just pause there.
I mean, this.
So the temple is not there, and we'll talk about that. But the place where the temple was is still there, and it's the Temple Mount. And just so, in case you're interested, the last set of maps is set from the book of what on the right, you see how the temple was situated in the Temple Mount. And then on the left, it's a little further, but that sort of T, that sidewise T, and 31 is the Devere, which is the Holy of Holies. And I'm not exactly sure about this, but I believe the veil, so the veil that was torn at the crucifixion, at the time of the crucifixion, I believe that covered the Devere. I think that's where that veil was. So this was the most sacred part of the temple. Now, when there are other, sometimes I will do a little reading when it's just snippets, but this idea of, so that the temple itself is a very sacred place, but then there's a kind of mythology that then gets built around this. So for example, and particularly around this idea of it being a thin place, of it being a place where God comes into contact with human beings. So Karen writes a little later, when Yahweh completed creation, he planted a garden, the Garden of Eden, where he walked in the cool of the evening and conversed familiarly with the first human beings at the dawn of history. This became identified with the site of the temple, that suddenly the temple had been placed in the center of the Garden of Eden, where God had walked with Adam and Eve. Now, we don't believe that's true historically, but that seemed to be true imaginatively and even theologically for many ancient Jews. And what's important here, as in all myths of a lost paradise, Eden was a place where there had been easy access to the heavenly world. I think that's what connects these two. So, and then they talk about the furniture and the furnishings of the temple, which reflected ancient Jewish cosmology in terms of the candlesticks, and trying to give one the impression that Eden and the temple were experiences of the primal wholeness which human beings all over the world sought in their holy places. So that's how the temple comes to figure there. Okay. So that's the happy part. Now comes the first in the string of unhappinesses. So let's move forward to page 54. And Ellen, would you, yes, would you read for us? Could you, it's the end of the second line, to the end of that paragraph, it says the temple and Yahweh's enthronement.
The temple and Yahweh's enthronement, therefore, were the basis for Solomon's claim to Jerusalem as the eternal heritage of the house of David. The construction of the temple was an act of conquest, a means of occupying the promised land with divine backing. The edifice proclaimed that Israel's days of wandering had come to an end. The people of the United Kingdom had finally come home and established themselves in a place where they could live in close intimacy with the divine.
Let's stop there. Okay, so we've moved from theology to policy. And I think she chose her words very carefully there. The construction of the temple was an act of conquest. It won't be the last time that's said, just as a parenthesis. But what do we think about that? And now let's just have a minute or two of discussion. That's at some level that's an inflammatory statement. I mean, David was king, Solomon was his son. You know, why would that be an act of conquest?
Another part of the world, it was something that Catholic Spain did in the New World. Mexico City, the Inca temples, Peru, elsewhere, constantly imposing their churches often using the very stones in pagan temples.
Right, we'll come back to that.
Now, that was centuries later.
Of course.
Right, but this is it has a long pedigree, right? right. They didn't invent it, right? You know, they were doing something that essentially was, you could say it's almost in the DNA of Jerusalem. You know, that claiming this sacred place, and therefore my version of the holy, my version of the sacred, you know, and I'm putting my stamp on it. And honestly, what I think we will read about is that there is now a series of erasures of people coming to claim it anew and essentially wiping out what was there before. Mary.
Was it actually a pagan site before? I mean, do we sort of?
Yeah, I think it was. And she calls it Jebusite, and so I think there were, and there is this, and I'm really not enough of an expert here, but there were. She talks about the fact that for Solomon, even the God, the Jewish God, was actually maybe not the only God. He was the most high God, he was the most important God, but he had this big harem, you know, all of his wives, Pharaoh's daughter. They also had at least altars, if not temples. And there is apparently a strain in the Old Testament, and I don't know enough about the Old Testament, but where Solomon was thought to be a bit of an idolater. Maybe one of the people who knows more about the Old Testament could comment on that. But it clearly had been pagan, and as one and this idea of a sacred site is usually not sacred to only one group. So you have a grotto, you have a temple, there's something thin about that area that transcends individual faiths, and that many come to claim it in different ways. So
also if you're overlaying a newer belief on top of something like, you know, paganism, why not use an existing site where people are familiar with it and there's already a connection and an understanding?
Right, so there's a practical reason as well as perhaps a theological one.
That whole conquest of Canaan is kind of one religious site after another being converted or utilized. And there's also the sense that this is what God has given you. So the author of this says that that it's an act of conquest, but I think the people who were building it would say it was an act of divine right that God handed this to us. Much like Americans think that,
Right.
North America was, given to them.
Right.
Well, the thing too of the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, which does not say there are no other gods other than me. It just says I am primary. And that I think is reflected in what you said.
Peter?
But it's always been fascinating that aside from whatever power may have resided inside that ark, story has it that those commandments, the physical pieces, were carried around in there. And that became such a holy idea that even if back then there were other gods, the Jews who were committed to that, just as the Jews who became committed to Jesus, they were committed to the idea of the mono, not many.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating that may have been built on the pagan temple, but once that became such a sacred thing, it's not all that big. In the stories, it's like the size of that table. They built a temple over that mono idea, over a pagan.
Right,
Ruin.
right. Elvin?
I read in some other books that the Jews frequently had their inner temple where God resided and other people couldn't go except a priest was empty. So to put the ark inside the empty space made that space unique. But I think also building a temple says that there's a material manifestation, well, there is a material manifestation, which if we can't defend it, it's knocked down. So it's a challenge to the defenders as well as to the people who might want to knock it down. But all the things I've read about the early Jews is that they were frequently administrators of city-states and that they were frequently not really monotheistic. I mean, maybe they believed in the one God more than other gods, but they would also worship the Caesar or the emperor or whoever it is, more or less to be compatible with their followers,
Okay.
the people they ruled over.
Okay. So Dean reminded us that the Lord giveth, but the Lord also taketh away, and the temple is destroyed. So, Elvin, could you let Miriam read on page 79? Could you read the first paragraph of page 79, the exile and return?
The destruction of Jerusalem and its temple was in some profound sense the end of the world. Yahweh had deserted his city, and Jerusalem had become a desert wasteland, like the formless chaos that had preceded creation. The destruction was an act of decreation, like the flood that had overwhelmed the world at the time of Noah. As Jeremiah had predicted, the desolate landscape from which even the birds had fled seemed to presage the overturning of cosmic order. The sun and moon gave no light, the mountains quaked, and no people could be seen on earth at all. Poets recalled with horror the memory of the Babylonian troops rushing through the temple courts and the sickening sound of their axes hacking away at the cedar panels. They longed for vengeance and dreamed of smashing the heads of Babylonian babies against a rock. The people of Judah had become a laughingstock. No wonder the Gentile nations asked derisively, "Where is their God?" Without a temple, there was no possibility of making contact with the sacred in the ancient world. Yahweh had disappeared. Jerusalem was a heap of rubble, and the people of God were scattered in an alien territory.
Thank you. So what's so powerful here, and then she goes on for many dozens of pages, is some of the writings about the temple and what happened in the temple and what should happen in the temple get more and more explicit when there's no temple. So all of that is being written with a memory of essentially this lost Eden, the bridge that is broken between God, and then there's this kind of fixation on it. There's an obsession with it, and they write about the physical parts of it that no longer exist and what should happen. So, but I think we should notice that this wonderful idea of Eden, this place where God is in human contact, suddenly becomes they dream of smashing the heads of Babylonian babies against a rock. So the loss of this space becomes a source of, because that's not defense anymore. That's vengeance, right? And that's another sense of erasure. And so that's kind of deeply embedded in the idea, even in the ancient Jewish idea of what Jerusalem meant. And coming back to Jerusalem in some ways means killing innocent children who had nothing to do with the initial loss, but this loss was so profound, so dislocating, so decreating that all of the rationality disappears. And some of you may have looked with wonder, as most of us did, a couple of weeks ago at the first pictures of the black hole, And it really seemed to me, because I was reading this at the same time, that Jerusalem is a kind of religious black hole, in the sense that rationality around it's so powerful, it draws everything into it, and the people who were rational, that there's kind of light around the rim, but once you actually get on the inside, people lose their kind of rational moorings. That's my own interpretation. She doesn't say that anywhere. That's just me. But it's so powerful that all kind of time and space sort of loses its context, and it disappears. So they do come back, and now we come to King Herod, who usually is not a hero in most of our imaginations, right? He does some pretty nasty things, but he also essentially, so that the temple was rebuilt, but then he does an extreme makeover of the temple. But before we get to Herod, let's just look for a second at the timeline. So Cyrus frees the Jews in 538. The temple comes back. About 300 years later, 250 years later, King Antiochus of Syria plunders the temple. He dedicates it to Zeus. So most of us forget that there's a time where there's another little one. Then around that time, Judas Maccabeus retakes the temple. But now what in 64 BC, so this is 2 generations before Jesus is born, Pompey conquers Syria, and the Roman army is quartered on the Temple Mount. So Rome is now Rome is not yet the empire, but Rome is the military force, the major military force in the Middle East. And it's important to note that from 64 to the birth of Jesus is a time of huge upheaval in the Roman world. So Julius Caesar, essentially the Roman Republic had become ungovernable. That's why you have these, what they call the triumvirates, of these 3, usually generals, trying to organize it and to rule it. And they have a first triumvirate, of which Julius Caesar was a part. They have a second, and Pompey was a part. And then Julius, if you remember, he was gaining too much power. He was going towards a kingship. And what happens? He is assassinated in the Roman Senate. Shakespeare tells us a lot about that. All of that is true. But then there is this civil war between Caesar's heir, Octavius, as he's called then, and Mark Antony, and Lepidus is the third one, and he gets offed pretty quickly. But Mark Antony, Cleopatra, Octavius eventually wins at the Battle of Actium in 19 BC. Mark Antony, who actually figures prominently in the history of Jerusalem, commits suicide with Cleopatra. But this is a time of huge upheaval in the Middle East and the Roman world. It eventually settles down with Augustus Caesar being the first emperor, and that's why they now have roads. Those Roman roads, very straight, very they were terrific engineers, but they also thought very linearly. If I need to get between here and Jennifer, and that's in the way, I just knock it out of the way, right? Because that's what the Romans, that's what you did. So the Pax Romana was essentially, in some ways, that's being set up. It was not political peace. Certainly not, because the Republic had been destroyed. You've got this strongman ruler who's got the army at his disposal, and they essentially just take out any people who are objecting. So it's not peace in the sense that we think of peace. It's peace in the sense there's stability and order, but it's really a sort of Eastern European kind of concept of peace, and that's not one that people are necessarily content with. So the civil war ends in 27 BC. In 19 BC, Herod starts giving the temple an extreme makeover and extends the platform. And now we're actually to probably one of the few things that we will actually be able to see in Jerusalem is the platform of the temple of Herod. And let's go to page. Actually, this is pretty short, so I'll read it. Herod was equally careful to avoid offending the Jews. So Herod was quite an administrator, as you said.
Page.
Oh, I'm sorry, page 128, the first paragraph. As part of his ambitious building program, the largest ever accomplished by a minor ruler, he transformed the holy city and made it one of the most important metropoles of the East. Ever mindful of security, Herod's first act was to build a massive fortress, begun in 35 BC on the site of the citadel built by Nehemiah at the city's most vulnerable point, north of the Temple Mount. Since he was still friends with Mark Antony, he called the new fortress Antonia after his patron. So there's a map here. This is now the second map. It's the one next to it says Herodian Jerusalem, 4 BC to 70 CE. Okay, so by the way, there's I put these next to each other. There's a slight change of scale between the left and the right. On the right, the city walls are actually a little smaller, but the dotted line is again the essentially the walls of medieval Jerusalem. But now you can see that where the Temple Mount is on the eastern, kind of mid-eastern central site, there's the Antonia, which would have been this part that we just read about, which is just to the north of that. But then you can see there are the walls. Herod's palace is now a little bit, it's over to the left, the west, so you can see that wall there. But then above Herod's palace, that's where you get outside, you get Golgotha and the tombs. So the Temple Mount is the inner part, the upper east side of ancient Jerusalem, which is the upper city. That's where Herod's palace would have been. That would have been to the south. But then to the north of that, there was a wall. And outside of that would have been to the west, would have been Golgotha and the tombs. So we're going to come to the end of this, just a little bit behind. So she has fantastic pages and pages of what it would have been like. But if you look on page 131 of the book, for those of you who have it, you'll see the Temple Mount. And what you'll see two people praying in front of that's the Western Wall. And then you'll see what Herod did, which were these big blocks, and then above the big blocks are the littler blocks. Those littler blocks, it's about 20 feet of littler blocks. And you can get that from the size of the people, the men praying at the bottom. So it's about 20 feet. You can imagine most of the time we'll be walking 20 feet above where Jesus walked. Not everywhere, but on average. That's because So think about 9/11. Think about when those towers came down. Think of how long it took for big machinery to take out the rubble. It took years in some cases. Actually, I think it took about 9 months is what I remember. But that was with big, heavy machinery. There was no big, heavy machinery in ancient Jerusalem. There were slaves, but it was human. So most of the time when something was destroyed, the rubble was essentially, maybe the top level would have been pulverized, but you built on top of it. You didn't remove it and start again. That just happens with layer after layer after layer. Okay, so the Middle East, even though Rome is stable, the Middle East is still not particularly stable, and Jerusalem in particular is not stable. So Jesus is crucified in 33 AD. There are zealots in Jerusalem who object to the Romans. They're constantly a thorn in the imperial side. Masada, where there is this massive, essentially suicide. I can't. Anybody remember how many people died at Masada? Hundreds, but it was hundreds. It wasn't a couple. It wasn't even a dozen. It was hundreds.
No, and they had a cistern there, so they held out for
as long as they
how
could,
long.
and they forced the Roman legions to come and take imperial resources to deal with this group of crazy zealots who eventually destroyed themselves. But this did not go over well in Rome. They were not happy with having to constantly deal with this tiny little group of people that just seemed to them to be nuts. They were just nuts. And nothing would make them kind of fall in line. So this continues, and then finally there's another revolt, and in 70 AD the Romans have had enough. And Robin, would you like to read on page 151, the beginning of the last paragraph, where it says the Jews were unlucky?
Jim, I just want to interject. We should just note for the record that our Jewish cousins would be offended by the notion of the people at Masada being nuts. That they were great heroes in Jewish history.
I was saying from the Roman perspective. Yeah. From the Roman perspective, the ruling perspective. So by the way, as I understand it, Judea was called a client kingdom. So when the Roman Senate appointed Herod, as the king. There's no line of David or any. I mean, they probably tried to get someone who wouldn't have been completely unacceptable. But it was the Romans who determined essentially what happened. And from the Roman imperial point of view, the ancient Jews were not completely rational. Let's put it this way. I'm sure they thought that, and I'm not sure that, well,
They were radical.
they were certainly radical, and they were extremists. They were extremists, okay?
Just about Masada, that story is so important that today Israeli military officers are commissioned
At Masada.
And just one other one, the Romans believed that before you could attack something, you had to encircle it. So Masada is a giant imposing geological formation, and the Romans built a wall around it, like about the size of a man, completely around it, and then built this giant ramp. And I'm thinking that the folks in Masada are looking out and going, these guys are crazy. But the discipline they had for that is phenomenal.
I don't know if it's part of this trip, but it's worth going to. It's preserved very well. And there are, you see the odds the Romans were against to scale that mountain to get up to it. It's kind of imposing. But
Right. Actually, Robin, I'm going to ask, would you turn the page and actually read the first part of the paragraph that says, and so?
Sure.
I'm sorry, page numbers? I'm on page-
152.
And so, when the Roman troops finally broke into the inner courts of the temple on 28th of August, they found 6,000 Jewish zealots waiting to fight to the death. The Greek historian Dio Cassius, died 230, said that the Jews defended themselves with extraordinary courage, deeming it an honor to die in the defense of their temple. Right up to the end, they observed the purity laws, each fighting in its appropriate place, and despite the danger, refusing to enter forbidden areas. The ordinary people fought in the forecourt and the nobility in the inner courts, while the priests defended the temple building itself. Finally, they saw the temple catch fire, and a terrible cry of horror arose. Some flung themselves into the swords of the Romans, others hurled themselves into the flames. But once the temple had gone, the Jews gave up.
Why don't you stop there? So I think that kind of encapsulates what was happening. And so it was over. The temple was gone. And essentially, Jerusalem becomes a military barracks for the Roman army. It's not even much of a city anymore. It's just a fort full of essentially pagan soldiers. Now, we're going to move ahead, but let's just remember that so Jerusalem has been destroyed. It's utterly gone. And this is the time when the Gospels start to be written. So when people are saying sort of, weep for Jerusalem, or Jesus is saying, weep for Jerusalem, there will be these terrible afflictions that come upon you. Everyone has just witnessed that. And my understanding is that people thought that the second coming was just around the corner, and that the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem was a heralding event, that it really could be essentially at any moment. And this is the context in which our Gospels are being written. I mean, the letters of Paul are in the sort of late 50s and 60s, and please, New Testament scholars, correct me, but I think that the Gospels are being written in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s. Is that about right?
Some of them.
Some of them.
The oldest.
Yeah, the oldest.
The earliest ones. Okay, but before this, so there are essentially two generations of Christians after the crucifixion who've been living around Jerusalem, but nothing is yet codified. And it doesn't start, the earliest codification of the Gospels is after the temple is destroyed. So it has to have been even worse for them than 9/11 was for us in New York City. I mean, that's the kind of emotional, searing, lacerating event that would have been. I mean, everybody had post-traumatic stress. Okay. So now the Jerusalem is a fort. And this part is what I completely didn't know before we started. And then we have a new event. So on page 161, Mary, would you like to read the paragraph on page 161 that starts with the Christians must have seen?
The Christians must have seen the hand of God in the next development in Jerusalem. In 118, the Roman general Publius Aelius Hadrianus became emperor, one of the ablest men who ever held this office. His ambition was not to extend the empire, but to consolidate it. Hadrian wanted to build a strong and united polity, a brotherhood in which all citizens, regardless of their race and nationality, could feel at home. One of the chief ways in which he tried to publicize and implement this ideal was by the royal progress through his imperial domains. Hadrian spent almost half his reign on the road with a huge and magnificent entourage, which was meant to give bystanders the impression of a whole capital city on the march. In each city, he would hear petitions and present gifts to the local people, hoping to leave behind the image of a benign and powerful government. He particularly liked to leave a permanent memento of his visit in the form of a building or monument, a temple for Zeus in Athens, or aqueducts in Athens, Antioch, Corinth, and Caesarea. This would provide a physical link with Rome and permanently embody the emperor's benevolence toward his people. When Hadrian arrived in Jerusalem in 130, he decided that his gift to the people of Judea would be a new city. The generous emperor would replace the unsightly ruin and desolate army base of Jerusalem with a modern metropolis called Aelia Capitolina. It would thus bear his own name and honor the gods of the capital in Rome, who would be its patrons.
Okay. So we're moving to our second question. So we've talked about what Jerusalem meant to the ancient Jews and what they did in terms of their buildings and a little bit about what had been the previous buildings. But now, what does Jerusalem mean to the ancient Romans, and particularly so in the, let's say, in this time, and how did this meaning affect the imperial approach to buildings of the previous governments and to its own buildings? So I had no idea about this part of Jerusalem's history. I mean, he basically says, okay, you're an army fort. I'm going to give you a whole new city. And it's going to be this wonderful Roman city. There's going to be a forum, and there are going to be baths, and there'll be a temple to Zeus, and there'll be statues of the emperor, and it's going to be great, right? And the Jerusalem religiously meant nothing except politically it was a pain in the side, and religiously it didn't mean anything. So now you're going to get what I think is, what we all think is a modern city. And so that's the next map where it
But
says.
that's his expression of domination over the Jews.
Completely. Well, it's just,
He didn't think the Jews would like it.
he didn't care.
He didn't care, I'm sure, but I think he knew they wouldn't like it, but this was saying, now you are Hadrianville. You are not Jews of your own say-so. I mean, it was a dominance behavior.
Completely dominant. And by the way, this is pure imperial Rome, right? You know, I mean, we look at it through perhaps a slightly different lens, but this is what the Romans did to everybody.
Yeah.
So Hadrian would have said, don't take it personally, you know, Antiochus, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's just, you're going to get a new city. So here it is, Aelia Capitolina. By the way, this is me. I put a little cross where we think Golgotha is. just because suddenly you'll notice there, well, now you see walls for the most part. The Temple Mount it does actually have two gods on it. It's got a statue of Hadrian, because the emperor is a god in imperial Rome, and Antoninus Pius is his successor. So you've got statues of deities on the Temple Mount, but you have a forum, you have a temple of Aphrodite, where essentially the cave of the resurrection is. At least it's the goddess of love. You know, it could have been a temple to Mars. I suppose it could have been worse. But so you've got Aphrodite there. And by the way, you'll see, but notice the straight lines. There are almost no curved lines here. You see straight Roman roads. And you see something called Cardo and Cardo Maximus. So that's essentially a road that the Romans word for road. And medieval pictures of Jerusalem you can see the two cardines, the two lines, and we may see some mosaics. But it just becomes completely transformed. There's nothing about the old temple, Herod's palace, anything else. There are some pools in the north, the Temple of Asclepius, so that would have been the medical center, so that's good. But this is just a complete Roman, secular, imperial, you'll love it, in quotes. Yes, Albert.
At that time, was the cult of the Virgin Mary already beginning to manifest itself?
So
I mean, did they choose the Temple of Aphrodite because Mary was at the crucifixion, sort of to create a...
So I don't want to put words in her mouth, but almost certainly not. There was no sense. So first of all, Christians would have had nothing to do with the planning, right, of this city. So there's nothing there. And we're going to come to that in the next little bit.
A sort of layering of overpowering what was going on among the Jews, or the Christians now, former Jews.
Yeah, that I wouldn't know, but I don't think it had anything to do with anything other than we like Aphrodite and Zeus.
The Cardo for ancient Roman cities was also often that they'd look at wind patterns, and so where the air would flow, so before air conditioning, and they're trying to get a kind of a breeze going through the city.
I have a couple of questions. The first is, are there these statues of Hadrian and Antonius, are they still there?
No.
All right. Well, I wasn't sure because the way you were saying it, it sounded like they were. The second is, I assume it would be the Temple of Venus instead of Aphrodite because Venus was the Roman name.
Yeah, so I have to say, in the Middle East, often they still use the Greek names. If it were in Rome, it would definitely be the Temple of Venus. But I think on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, they often still use the Greek names.
Well, not having read the book, I wasn't sure.
Actually, you will walk along the Cardo a few times.
Oh, great, Peter.
And you will want to visit the British Museum after this trip, because virtually everything that was once there is now in the British Museum.
Right, okay. So, page 162. So, I'm sorry, Peter.
No, just referencing back to the forum this morning, it occurs to me that their plan was their plan, and they didn't really care about the locals at all. But the aqueduct, the idea that you had fresh water sourcing through a city in the desert in a way that perhaps it hadn't at all before. Not that everyone would fall down and say, these guys are great, but that whole water is politics, water is survival thing is performance money.
Oh, that's interesting.
One wonders what the most bereft, impoverished, and enslaved people thought, like, we actually don't have to go to the well and walk 1,000 yards with hot water on our head anymore. I don't know, I wonder how that affected the politics.
Yeah, one of the things that our history professor taught us about
what the Roman Empire did well was when they took over an area, they did try to create a relative sense of peace. The guys that were in charge of the different city-states, their job was to keep peace. And so that's one of the reasons that Greek terms stayed in some of the more heavily Greek areas. They didn't try to obliterate a culture. They tried to keep things running pretty smoothly. You're just Romans now, but you may still speak Greek. And so water was one of the things that they would provide.
Great. So Jennifer, would you do us a favor, please? And on page 162, about 6 lines down, read to the end of the paragraph where it says, but now construction.
But now construction and building had become a weapon in the hands of the victorious empire. Aelia Capitolina would annihilate Jewish Jerusalem, whose shrine had symbolized the whole of reality and the innermost soul of its people. All this would disappear under the Roman city. This imperial building program would be an act of decreation. Chaos would come again. It would not be the last time in the history of Jerusalem that a defeated people would have to watch their holy city and its beloved landmarks disappear under the streets, monuments, and symbols of a hostile power, and feel that its very self had been obliterated.
So essentially twice now, the Romans have violated Jerusalem, right? First with the in 70 with the future Emperor Titus, and now Hadrian just kind of massively erasing essentially and putting a Roman lid, if you will, on Jewish Jerusalem.
Well, you're speaking from a Jewish standpoint, not from the Roman standpoint.
True. Okay, and it was like that for a couple hundred years. And so now we're going to move to Christian Jerusalem. And so in 313, the Edict of Milan from Constantine legalizes Christianity. Now, just to say, this isn't my period, as some historians would say, but as far as I remember, Constantine doesn't actually convert to Christianity until his deathbed. His mother is Saint Helena is very active, but he legalizes it, but he's still the Pontifex Maximus, which is a pagan Roman term, the greatest of the bridge makers. That's, I think, what that means, the Pontifex Maximus. So he becomes Roman emperor in 306. He legalizes Christianity 10 years later, roughly 10 years later. But 10 years after that, in 325, there's the Council of Nicaea, right, the Nicene Creed, which, and there's the Arian heresy that's going on. So there's a lot of kind of early Christian formation at this time, but it's not like Christianity is immediately dominant everywhere. It's accepted, but it's not yet dominant. And Jerusalem is, well, let's read about what it is. So how about page 171? No, page 171. And Elbrun, would you like to read? It's about, we're going to read actually a paragraph and a half, but about 9 lines down, it says, there is no evidence that Jerusalem, do you see that? 171, there is no evidence.
That's funny.
12 lines down.
What can I see? It's 171. What was?
The sentence
Oh yeah.
starts
Okay.
to the
Sure.
right,
It's
yeah.
more than 9 lines. Yeah.
Sorry, can't count.
There is no evidence that Jerusalem was a major pilgrim center for Christians during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. In fact, Gentile Christians tended to agree with the Gospels of Matthew and John. Jerusalem was now the guilty city because it had rejected Christ. Jesus had said that in the future, people would not gather in such holy places as Jerusalem, but would worship him in spirit and truth. Devotion to shrines and holy mountains was characteristic of the paganism and Judaism, both of which Christians were anxious to transcend.
So let's stop right there, because let's try to imagine that we are Christians in 325. So what does Jerusalem, at that point, in 325, what does Jerusalem mean to us?
The Jews that didn't accept Christ as the new.
Well, is it a happy place or not? No, it's a terrible place.
Yeah, because it's a place where he was crucified.
It's a place where he was
According to what you just read over there.
Sorry?
It's Dallas.
It's Dallas, right? It's Dallas. Okay, so if with your indulgence, we're going to take about 3 minutes and do a little Platonic metaphysics, because it's really important to understand the mindset of the 4th century Christians. Most people at this time were Platonists, and to understand Plato, it's probably his worldview, which was in some ways their worldview. You need to understand that Plato spent his entire life trying to reconcile the fact that Athens, the glory of Greece, had executed his beloved teacher, Socrates. Plato could not get over this. It scarred him for life. And as therapy, he did philosophy and left us all of these fabulous tomes. But he had to figure out how could the Athenians, who were the best of the Greeks, and the Greeks were the best of all people, how could the best of all the peoples still execute the best of the Athenians? This was a major problem for him. And so he comes up with this idea of the allegory of the cave. So as human beings, we are all chained in a cave and we're looking at the back wall. And the only thing that we can see are shadows of like shadow puppets, because there are people behind us who are putting like little horses and cows and people on sticks, and they're projecting this onto the back of the cave. That's what we know as human beings, and through our senses, through the physical world. The philosopher manages to break free of his chains, go outside, actually see the real world, and eventually can look at the sun, which is the source of all being, and that's reality. When the philosopher comes back to tell people, you poor fools, benighted fools, you don't understand, this isn't reality, reality is out there, they kill him, because they are much more comfortable with their shadows and their ignorance. So Plato sets up this dualism of the material world is essentially bad and unreal, as opposed to the spiritual world where there is beauty and truth, and the ideal forms. So the idea of a number, that's a pure thing, that is real, not the number 2 that you write down on a piece of paper. So that's how he, quote, solves his problem of how you would kill a philosopher who's telling you about beauty and truth. But that then becomes this dualistic, the spiritual is good, the earthly is bad. Anything that celebrates the material is wrong, and you have to look through it to get to the spiritual, which is truth.
Sounds like Christianity.
So St. Augustine Christianized Plato, the way Thomas Aquinas Christianized Aristotle. But these were the ideas that were very much in the time, and we inherited a lot of that baggage into Christianity, right? And not all of it has been happy, but that's certainly the sort of the intellectual tides that the 4th century Christians are swimming in when Christianity is legalized. So let's read then the next bit, which is, let's go to page, we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to skip ahead some. We're going to go to page 178. And Jennifer, why don't you read, it's now 1, 2, 3, 4, to the 5th line where it says Eusebius. Eusebius is the bishop, by the way, who baptizes Constantine on his deathbed. And he is the bishop of Jerusalem. Eusebius?
Eusebius once wrote a sharp letter to Constantia, the emperor's sister, who had foolishly asked him for a picture of Jesus. Christians should look through the flesh to the divine essence of the heavenly Logos. After his sojourn on earth, the Logos had returned to the spiritual realm, and Christians should follow him there. The attachment of permanent value to Jesus' humanity was as perverse and irrational as the Jews' attachment to an earthly city. Christians were engaged in a constant catharsis or purification. They must learn to read scripture in a more spiritual way, looking for the timeless truth within the historical event. Thus, Jesus' resurrection was not the dramatic, eruptive act that Athanasius envisaged. It simply revealed the immortality that was natural to the human condition.
So this sounds pretty foreign to us, right? Right. This is not sort of the Book of Common Prayer, sort of theology. It's really hard, I think, to imagine how strong that dualism was and how much contempt there was actually for material things, including, and maybe even especially, Jerusalem, which had been this place of trauma. So suddenly that changes. And that changes because, in some ways because of St. Helen, but they discover the tomb. They discover the place where they think the resurrection happened. And suddenly they have to reorganize all of their thoughts about the living human Jesus, because emotionally it becomes very powerful. This is a kind, remember, there's a philosophic construct, all this Platonism, and suddenly they find the tomb, and the Platonists essentially are overrun by the emotions of actually discovering the places where Jesus was. But at that point, it's already buried. They're having to dig to find it. They do find it. And let's just go to Miriam, right? Elbrin, would you loan her your book on page 182? The 6th line where it says Constantine had taken possession of the center point. Yeah. To the end of the paragraph.
Constantine had taken possession of the center point of Roman Aelia and transformed it into a Christian holy place. He had built a new Jerusalem beside the Forum of Aelia. Hitherto, Aelia had been off the spiritual map of most Gentile Christians, and in the city itself, the church had been marginalized, located outside the walls in the largely uninhabited suburb of Mount Sion. Now Constantine had demonstrated the centrality of the new faith to his empire. It was a gesture that immediately captivated the Christian imagination. As soon as the tomb had been discovered and the lovely basilica completed, Christians started to evolve their own mythology about the place, which located it at the heart of their spirituality. They recalled the old Jewish Christian tradition that Adam had been buried at Golgotha. Soon they had also come to believe that Abraham had bound Isaac for sacrifice there. This new Christian holy place had started to inspire the same kind of belief and legend as the old Jewish temple. It had become a symbolic center where the divine power had touched the frail world of humanity in a unique way. It represented a new start for humanity, a fulfillment of the religion of Abraham and a new era in Christian history.
Let's stop there. So this is kind of a big pivot, right? Of when Christians actually sort of start to cherish the holy places in Jerusalem, which had not been there before. But notice how now these are her words, but suddenly that imaginative axis, it's not only where Jesus was crucified and resurrected, it's where, Abraham bound Isaac and where maybe Adam had been, we want to get it all in one place, right? So that it's a destination for everything. And that's not unique to Christians, but it seems to be one of those recurring themes. Okay. So we're actually a little behind time because I do want us to.
Falling fast.
well, we've actually made it through sort of 3 of the 4, and now we want to get to the Muslim layers, if you will. So Jerusalem is not as central to to Islam as it is to Judaism and to Christianity. So let's do we have any Islamic scholars in the group? I hope I haven't offended anybody so far, but so this is very thin territory for me. But maybe we could, Mary, I'm going to ask you to read page 222, just to give us a little context. The second paragraph that starts with Muhammad fell deeply, but go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines to the Meccan Haram.
Start there.
Yeah, and read to the end of this paragraph.
The Meccan Haram had been the site of the Garden of Eden, where Adam had been created, had named the animals, and had been honored by all the angels. Mecca thus represented that lost paradise, which could be momentarily recovered by performing the traditional rites of this holy place. The shrine was later rebuilt by Seth, Adam's son, by Noah after the flood, and by Abraham and Ishmael. Finally, it had been rebuilt by Qusabi ibn Kilab, the ancestor of the Meccan tribe of Quraysh. The Kaaba linked the past with the present, the human with the divine, the internal world with the external.
Okay, great. So Mecca is much more for Islam what Jerusalem might have been for Jews and Christians. And in 638, the Caliph Umar takes Jerusalem peacefully. So this is now 300 years after the Council of Nicaea. Islam is on the rise, and Christians and Jews are protected in Jerusalem as minorities. So the Muslims take over.
You take Jerusalem from the Romans.
From the Byzantines. So the Romans have been, Rome falls in.
The empire split.
Right. The empire is split.
Right.
Jerusalem isn't that important. So there is a bishop in Jerusalem, but it's now very peaceful. So the Muslims take over, and let's just read a little bit about what that transition was like. So Robin, page 229. It's about 12 lines down, 13. While he was standing beside the tomb.
While he was standing beside the tomb, the time for Muslim prayer came around, and Sophronius,
He's the old bishop,
invited the Caliph to pray where he was. Umar courteously refused. Neither would he pray in Constantine's martyrium, Instead, he went outside and prayed on the steps beside the busy thoroughfare of the Cardo Maximus. He explained to the patriarch that had he prayed inside the Christian shrines, the Muslims would have confiscated them and converted them into an Islamic place of worship to commemorate their caliph's prayer in the Bait al-Maqdis. Umar immediately wrote a charter forbidding Muslims to pray on the steps of the martyrium or to build a mosque there. Later, he would pray in the Nia and again was careful to ensure that it would remain in Christian hands.
Okay, so let's stop there. So this is a very different takeover than we've seen so far, right? Every time we've seen it before, it's been an erasure, right? Or somehow a denial of what was past. He realizing that as ruler, if he prayed in a place, his followers would want to confiscate it. He's proactively thinking, I'm not going to do that to protect that place for the other faiths that are there. And we haven't seen that from any leader yet. So I think that's quite remarkable. Then we're going to skip around, but next, a little further down. Ever since the Persian occupation, when the Jews had resumed worship on the platform, the Christians had used the temple platform as the city rubbish dump. So we as Christians had perpetrated this idea of contempt and erasure, specifically against the Jews, so taking their holy place and making it a rubbish dump. And then she says here later that later Muslims would express their contempt for the Christian belief of the resurrection by calling the Anastasis, which was the place that built over the resurrection, the Al-Kumama, the dung heap, instead of the Al-Qiyama, the resurrection. So the Christians are disrespectful of the Jews. The Muslims are horrified by this. And then later Muslims actually disrespect the Christians for their disrespect of the Jews. So now you get these kind of sort of different layers of hostility and contempt and conflict over all of what should be holy places. Now, what they say is, by the way, any of you who are leaving, it's 2:15, so we're going to try to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so before we have some general discussion. But the idea that the Muslims were the most militaristic, at least according to Karen Armstrong, is not so. And they only become militaristic, in fact, in response to the Crusades. So we're going to fast forward. So he's got all these respect for sacred places. Page 245. Why don't you read down to there? Yeah, from the Muslims. This is the first paragraph on page 245.
The Muslims had established a system that enabled Jews, Christians, and Muslims to live in Jerusalem together for the first time. Ever since the Jews had returned from exile in Babylon, monotheists had developed a vision of the city that had seen its sanctity as dependent upon the exclusion of outsiders. Muslims had a more inclusive notion of the sacred, however. The coexistence of the three religions of Abraham, each occupying its own district and worshipping at its own special shrines, reflected their vision of the continuity and harmony of all rightly guided religion, which could only derive from the one God. The experience of living together in a city that was sacred to all three faiths could have led monotheists to a better understanding of one another. Unfortunately, this was not to be.
So the Muslims take the Temple Mount, and there's a sacred place there where they believe that the night ride of Muhammad occurred, and they build a mosque there. It's called the Dome of the Rock, and that's actually the largest dome that is in Jerusalem, and it's very beautiful. But it's kind of sits alone there on the Temple Mount. So she goes into great detail. It had been for centuries. It had been the city dump, and they had to, and the leader had to go and scrape it and clean it, and he did that according to Islamic tradition with the other workers, and then they eventually purify it. But they now make this holy place. They don't do anything bad to the Christian sites, but they take this other site that in fact had been not only disused but kind of desecrated and made it holy again. So this goes along, and then you've got the Crusades, and the Crusades kind of push things back. And so we're just going to read one little bit. The Crusades were not a high point for Christians in any way. We behaved miserably, particularly in Jerusalem. They talk about the fact when Crusaders actually took Jerusalem, they weren't celebrating anything at the holy places. They looted immediately, and it was 3 days of carnage. So it was again sort of Jerusalem being desecrated. And when Saladin retakes Jerusalem, eventually he invites the Jews and the Christians to stay. So again, there's Muslim tolerance of these minorities within the city. And the last thing we'll read together is on page 301, which is now the Caliph in 1200. This Al-Mu'azzam gives orders that the walls of Jerusalem be dismantled so that Crusaders would not be able to establish themselves there. So for example, the Dome of the Rock, it was now a sacred site for hundreds of years for the Muslims, the Crusaders come in and they deface it, and they put a cross on the top, and they cover over everything. So they do exactly the opposite of what the Muslims had done when they came into the holy city. We're respecting the holy places. They actually take the Muslim holy places and desecrate them. So this gave the Muslims a very bad feeling about the Christian West in general, because these were all sort of European Christians at the time. The ones that they trusted were the Greek Orthodox. So the Greek Orthodox have the keys to the Anastasis, because there's all this sectarian fighting about who gets to open what and who can do things. So they don't trust the Westerners who would she goes on at some length about how they would inflame passions, the Franciscans or whoever, and vie with each other. So the Muslims have not much time for that. But eventually in 1200, they take down the walls of the city because they don't want Crusaders coming back to be able to use it as a military outpost. So let's just read this last paragraph. Jennifer, maybe you could do that. So it's page 301 at the very bottom, where it says Al-Quds. Al-Quds means the holy, and that's the Muslim name for Jerusalem.
Al-Quds was no longer a viable city. Now that it had no walls, the Muslims dared not live there, while the Franks remained close by in the kingdom of Acre. The city became little more than a village, inhabited only by a few devoted ascetics and jurists, who somehow kept the new Ovid institutions going, and state officials and a handful of soldiers. Al-Muazzam's decision proved to be premature, since in 1221 the Crusaders were forced to return home. But the Crusades had so profoundly unsettled the region that it seemed impossible for Muslims to contemplate a Western presence with any degree of confidence or equanimity. A new defensiveness had entered the Muslim feeling for Jerusalem, which could be destructive to the city.
Okay, so it's really a tragic history, right? But it's that tragedy sort of goes back to this very deep feeling of how sacred it was, how important it was for the relationship between a deity and human beings, but how human beings had a very hard time respecting each other's views of that deity and their religious traditions. So that's all that I had to say about this. I mean, the book is fantastic. It's very well, researched. It's long. It does have chapters towards the end of it about what has happened since 1948, which are very interesting. But I hope this is giving you some sense of when you're walking 20 feet above where Jesus probably walked, what's in the meaning of those layers, because it's quite moving. It's quite moving.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Okay, you go. I'll see you. I'm gonna have my lunch up there. Or should I not? Because we're going to early dinner.
Any pilgrims that are flying out
I'm a physician.
on the Delta flight,
I'm a hematologist.
would you mind staying?
Just make sure, I just don't want to whack them.
On the Delta flight.
Very specific.
Yeah.
And